every poet has their lexicon, right? Like their toolbox that they draw from, like how do they speak to their experience of the world? And I think for me, because I have this day job as a clinical pharmacist where I see patients, I talk to them all day about their medications, about side effects they're having, about what it is they want to be able to do in their lives that they're not doing now because of health conditions. Propofol. My kidneys are leaning into the wall of my back like a pair of boxing gloves, the way my grandfather is leaning into the idea of an operating table, a paralytic agent, his body a space station for someone else's hands. I work in the hospital where it will happen. I work and wait for the part where the lungs I keep wanting this month to be stop huffing propane, stop threatening to make like my patient's vein and collapse. Inside the sterile compounding room, I shoot drugs down an IV bag's gut. I listen to the outer space hum of machines that eat the air out of the room. There's nothing sexy about incision. There's nothing about the phrase nasogastric tube that makes me want to look both ways before crossing the street. I want to hold him like he is something other than a mucous membrane. Like maybe the planet inside him is Pluto. Like it's not really a planet at all.
How'd you come up with this incredible title, Emergency Brake? It literally makes me stop when I see the text, right? Emergency brake.
I love the way it sounds in your mouth. You know, I love how it does kind of have that arresting sort of quality. And I think it speaks to the way that a lot of the poems kind of circle around this idea of you're going down one direction and then you just want to yank the brake and stop. And it felt like it spoke to different kinds of kind of emergency brakes in the book, whether that's drugs like benzodiazepines or sex or kind of friendship, any kind of intimacy, just the idea of how to get yourself to stop in your tracks.
Why this book needs breaks is the velocity of the poems. Like in one poem, we can be in one kind of physical space and then the next second we're somewhere totally, totally different.
I was waiting for my hairpins to turn back into gods. I was waiting for my pillow to stop resembling a guillotine. I was wondering whether I was the burnt rubber on the highway, the wad of gum my brother swallowed, and the stomach ache that followed. I was feeling like both the scalpel and the kidney, like I had opened a back entrance into a classroom, but the classroom had left. Like I was carrying my dead in my back pocket, which was also full of bees, like the blood inside the bees and the hemoglobin inside the blood. Like everything I had ever told my lover was tap dancing down my spine, I kept seeing myself wrapped around him like a car around a tree. I let the slow insomnia of August build a condo in my head, tear the plastic off the furniture the way I sometimes tear off my dress. I fed myself to a screen door. I let my mouth become a matchbook. I lit myself on fire. I didn't light myself on fire, but something smelled like it was burning. Some piano inside me fell over. My left hand gave my right hand sleeping pills, and my right hand took them.
Your poems leap and cut through time with so much momentum. So I was wondering, how do you get at all that? How do you hold that, all of those things in one poem?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, musicality is really what drives all the poems. So whenever I'm not one of those people who gets struck with inspiration, then sits down and writes an idea. I'm very much an ass and chair kind of writer where I will never feel especially inspired to write about anything in particular. I really just have to sit in the chair and see what happens. And usually those first drafts are all about like, how does it sound? What's the music? And I think that like with the poem I just read, it was very much this kind of beat of like, da-da, da-da, I was waiting for my hairpins to turn back into gods. I was waiting for, so I tend to use repetition as kind of the link between the very different associative things and how it sounds in my ear.
there's a lot of callbacks too, like, and these kind of through lines that come up again and again. I'm thinking about kidneys, how often kidneys come up in there. I'm thinking, of course, of pills. There's all these through lines, and that gets us to your other life of being a pharmacist. So could you also talk about how pharmacy, medicine, all of that plays into the world that Ruth builds and the speaker builds in this text?
I'm thinking a lot about the body pretty much all day, and I think that just naturally filters into my work and creates kind of the dictionary that I draw from, where a lot of times the things that I do think to compare images in the world to are, you know, their kidneys, their lungs, and those feel very intimate to me. I think for some people who maybe aren't as sciencey, like lungs might feel a little bit more abstract, or blood cells, but for me, like, that's everything. Like, what could be more intimate than your red blood cells?
And because you actually look at them, have seen them under a microscope, you actually have the cultural capital to know.
You know, a lot, yeah.
No, that's way cool. The things that you rub up together is just so amazing. To me, you definitely feel as though that you're a poet of simile. Of approximations instead of a poet of metaphor. And you know, metaphor has that aggressive collision that it's bam! And there's so much authority in metaphor, right? Like almost whenever we're teaching, we tell students, you know, metaphor over simile, like it's supposed to be stronger, but I love the way a simile can insinuate. Can you talk about the choice of simile over metaphor?
Yeah, so simile over metaphor, this is a constant struggle with my craft because simile is just much more comfortable for me. I think I like that distancing. I like that. You know, I think I'm not an especially confrontational person, so I hate the idea of telling someone what to think. And there's something about metaphor, you're saying this is this, that kind of invites someone to say, no, it's not, you know, or makes me feel like I'm bludgeoning them with a hammer. So simile to me is a lot more comfortable. And it also feels like it can hold a little bit more contradiction because I like to do this kind of associative stacking of where this is like this, but it's like this, but it's like this, where there's something about saying that it's like something where it feels like you can compare it to a million things, but if you say it is something, it kind of feels like you're locking it into this box. And so if you start saying that something is 55 things, at least I worry that it starts to feel a little too paradoxical and contradictory.
There's almost more truth in approximation. And I think from you working with that kind of figurative space makes these poems speak to more multiplicity, more notions of simultaneity to kind of, you know, throw all the postmodern terms out at the door at one time. And I think another thing that you talked about just now that I want to get into is the associative stacks that you do, being the poet of adjustment as well, that you keep on going. It's almost like you keep going like this. Here's the picture and you keep going,
Poet of adjustment, I love that.
Yeah, you keep on adjusting. Can you talk about that, especially with those associative stacks?
Yeah, so I think, you know, I'm sure you've heard before that people say that some of us were just writing the same poem over and over again. I forget which poet said that, probably all of them at some point.
Marie Howe, there it is, yes.
Yeah, I mean, so a fear of mine is I never want to feel like I am writing actually the exact same poem over and over again, but I think we all have poetic obsessions, right? And things that we kind of keep circling, you know, kind of like vultures over and over, and maybe sometimes it's dead and you're trying to beat some life into it.
There goes another simile. It's kind of like vultures. There it is, told you.
Like it's dead. I wouldn't just say it's dead.
Yes, see, there it is.
But, you know, I think that this poet of adjustment thing for me is, I think, kind of looking at these same obsessions, these same questions, but trying to do it from a different angle, seeing like what else can I glean from it if I look at it this way? What about that way? So I think there's something about when you throw all, there's kind of this like spaghetti at the wall approach for me where it's like I compare something to so many things, I leap in so many directions, and then it's like what feels the most honest to me. And I will say that a lot of times when I'm drafting, I'll have more leaps and I'll get rid of them because sometimes they compete with each other. You know, sometimes I feel like I'm kind of riffing and then it gets to the point where it's just this exhausting, like everything but the kitchen sink, like it's this, it's that, it's this, it's that. And so I pick which ones feel the truest and get rid of the others.
How do you figure out of when to get out, of when to go, and go ahead and stick it?
I think musically. I think that sometimes at a certain point, if I feel like I'm almost getting a little bored or like I'm hitting the same note over and over, because sometimes I feel like I'm doing the throat clearing thing where I found the image, but I don't know that it's the image, so I try it again, and then I go off and I try it again, and then maybe instead of 3 images, I just needed 2, or maybe I only needed 1 there, and I can go longer later.
One of the things with this text is it's before Me Too, it's preemptive with that, but it almost anticipates so many of the conversations that we're just knee deep into now. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how trauma and abuse and how to not fetishize pain and grief, but also not turn away from it.
Yeah, I mean, this was kind of a central question that was bugging me when I was writing the book was, I think that, I don't want to speak for anyone else, but for me personally, I think there's a kind of, it felt indulgent to write about, traumatic things, like almost like, oh, this is what people like to read, where, when you're giving them something with drama, I think it's a little more inherently, it can be more inherently interesting and salacious than if you're writing about trees. And so that made it hard for me from a craft perspective to figure out which poems were actually good versus which ones are like, I'm spilling secrets, so you're just inherently interested because we're all nosy, And so a lot of the revision of this book was culling which poems weren't necessarily that good from a craft perspective, but they made me look heroic, or I'm spilling some secrets so people are reading it with intrigue, but are those poems actually good? Do those poems stand on their own? Are they maybe, I'm trying to choose my words carefully, like are they maybe the kind of thing where I feel like it makes me a sympathetic narrator, a sympathetic speaker, because I'm talking about something really hard that might make someone not notice that maybe on a technical level they're not pulling their weight. So those are some questions I ask myself a lot.
Almost a performance of grief.
One of the worst impulses that a person can have that's very natural is when you're writing about, difficult things that have happened to you or trauma, you feel like you need to prove to people that like you didn't deserve it, or that what you say happened, or that it affected you in this way. And I think for me, at least, that kind of led me in some of the early drafts and poems that I cut into just sharing way more detail than I was comfortable with, almost to convince people. But the last few years especially, both when I was writing this book and since, when I've written about, traumatic things in prose, like in essay forms, I've really, really tried to get rid of that impulse to speak to a jury, where I'm not trying to convince the reader that I'm a sympathetic person. I'm not trying to convince them that they should believe that what I say happened. I'm coming from a place of I'm assuming they already do believe me, and if not, like they can go fuck themselves.
Yeah, trust
don't
in
read
the reader.
my poems.
Trusting the reader, I think, is so, so important. But I think one of the things that I dig the most is this idea of pointing the finger at the self. Even in my own writing, we both share a traumatic past. That was when my works, and what I always try to tell students is when you start going like this instead of like this, that's when you start to get the maturity. That's when you start to tell a deeper truth. And I think these poems do that, where the self does get incriminated. The self does, the bad thoughts are called out, bad times of being a partner are called out by the speaker, and that takes a real kind of emotional maturity. Do you think writing the text got you to that, or do you think living got you to that?
I think both. I actually, I think that a lot of the poems that were in early drafts of this weren't working because I hadn't gotten to that point of noticing any culpability in myself. I was still at the point of, I can finally tell this story. Like, this is interesting. Like, this is moving. I'm getting good feedback from people. Like, where I thought that just being able to write about, traumatic things that you've experienced was in and of itself an accomplishment. And it was. It did feel like a personal accomplishment, but that was a personal accomplishment.
Yeah, like journaling. Like, it needs to be for something else.
Yeah, like it didn't, I feel like there was something missing. And I showed an early draft of this book to Matthew Dickman, who I worked with at the Tin House Writers Conference the year that we went together. And, he brought up this really interesting point that I was grateful for, where he said that about a bunch of poems that aren't in this final draft, he said, like, wow, you're like really mad at your childhood friend who, was sort of, because I had kind of talked about some of the personal things that led to some of the poems. He had talked about, like, God, you're really mad at this girl who was abused alongside with you. Like, you really blame her for a lot of stuff. And I was like, well, yeah, it was kind of her fault. Like, she brought me into it. Like, she was being abused and she brought me over and wrote me into it. And he was like, okay, so she was a child, just like you.
There it is.
Like you were 9, but she was also 9.
Yeah.
He kind of, it was this very therapeutic moment where he was like, you have this anger toward her. I think you need to let that go.
Wow.
And I had never had a therapist or a friend say that to me. But it was kind of like, yeah, like, I am mad at a 9-year-old.
Wow. And to get that kind of narrative distance, like you almost needed somebody else to have those eyes so that you can find those eyes.
Yeah, and it's not like he told me you need to write poems about being a shitty person because you're a shitty person. But, it kind of got to the point of like, why, like, I think I needed to do that emotional work and to kind of let go of some of that anger and really think through, to kind of think through the complicated emotions of, what is it like to think back on something that happened to you as a child, but with kind of the knowledge you have as an adult, knowing that you still have incomplete knowledge and growth to do. And so I felt like a lot of the poems here couldn't have been written and couldn't work well until I had done some of that emotional work.
Yeah, to get that kind of third person distance that we get through essays and things of that kind of narration voice. That's really, really cool. Could you read If the Body Was a Door so we can get to those kind of, I guess, emotional juggling?
If the body is a door. I remember wondering whether the body was a pool, if it could be entered that easily. The way I enter dreams and play every character. One version of me petting the dog while another sets the school children on fire. And how the body is fire. This choice I have never had over what makes it burn. I remember when your mouth was a city I entered dancing. I remember being 9 at the time a stranger stuck his hand down my shorts. His penis rose like a fever, something inside him trying to torch its way out. This is another way of saying that the body is a form of restraint, and that restraint, like blood, deserts the body quickly. When I remember the past as burglary, I think the body is a door. And what is a door but a crime scene waiting to happen, the way a needle waits to happen to a vein? No matter how many times I mistake television light for the moon, someone will always walk through my neighborhood carrying their body blade side up. The Waffle House will pretend no one was open like a tangerine in its parking lot. The human heart will remain the size of 2 fists.
Oh my gosh, there's so many poems in this text that I could say are my favorite, but
Thanks, Doug.
I really do low-key think that one might be my favorite.
That's one of my favorites too. And I think that was one that I couldn't get published before the book came out.
I can't believe
Which
that.
is always like an interesting thing, like which ones get chosen and which ones don't.
I mean, it does all the Ruth things, quote unquote, and does them really, really well. So that really, really surprises me. A question that I've been coming back to again and again in these interviews, and it's kind of funny that this is going to land here again, but I think speaking from the wound and speaking from the scar, Diana Arturian talks a lot about that, about the difference between speaking from the wound versus speaking from the scar.
Ooh, I'm going to steal that.
Right?
I love that.
So do you think you speak from the wound or from the scar? The speaker here in Emergency Break.
Yeah, I mean, I think that part of it is for me, I feel like I really can't write well about anything that I'm still in. I really have to come at it from perspective. And I think that those early poems that didn't make it in the book were the exact epitome of that, where it was this kind of, I don't want to say self-congratulatory because I don't want to like discourage anyone else from writing about something traumatic, but I felt like my drafts were kind of self-congratulatory, almost like just sort of very much speaking from the wound, no perspective, kind of everyone else is bad. I'm good, but they're bad.
Yeah, and they screwed me over.
Yeah, but not really having the same empathy for others as I was directing toward myself. And to not like beat myself up too much, I think that it's hard to have empathy for yourself sometimes when you blame yourself for something. And so even being able to give yourself that empathy already was a huge leap for me maturity-wise. And so it felt like I was speaking from the scar, but I wasn't. And in my case, it took other people kind of telling me that and helping me think through it more. I'm sure there are others, I definitely know of some people who when something fucked up happens, they can sit and write that same day. I absolutely cannot.
Me
yeah.
neither. Well,
I need that kind of more clinical distance.
What do you think about poetry's capacity for personal salvation and healing?
I think for me, it has been healing in the sense that it makes me not regret kind of the shape that my life has taken. Like I think that some of these poems help me do some of that maturity and healing work I needed to do, but as you can tell, like writing them alone wasn't enough. I really had to do the work in here too. But I think they help me kind of circle these topics that I had been avoiding, because the thought was, when I've read other poems about traumatic things, I just remember feeling so grateful to the person who wrote them for kind of digging into that wound and letting us into it, for showing us the scar. And I wanted to, really, the reason I became a poet was because I wanted to make people feel the way that I feel reading poems that have really moved me.
Nice.
Yeah.
So when I first encountered your work, one of the things that I thought is like, this writer doesn't sound like anybody. Like, it was like your voice was just so refreshing. And again, I think it's the specificity of your imagery. I think it's the lexicon, the medical lexicon of your imagery. Like, turns of phrases so surprising. And, you know, I've read more and got more capital, and I could see, you know, I can see a little bit of people like Dean Young, Mary Ruffel, Matthew Zapruder. So could you talk about poets who influence you, who are your jams?
Yeah. Well, that's great to hear that you think I have my own Ruthness. I feel like that's always a goal, and that's, I think, one of the hardest things when you're starting out is finding what's your distinct voice, separate from the people who influence you. I mean, some of the earliest poets that I was reading who made me feel like, oh man, I really want to write like you were, Ilya Kaminsky, Terrence Hayes.
Yes.
Who else? Matthew Dickman, Marie Howe. I mean, what The Living Do was huge for me.
Yes.
And then kind of more recently, like Hala Aliyan has just blown me away. And do you ever write a poem like 5 years ago and then read a poem someone published today and think, I plagiarized that poem?
Yes.
Even though you wrote it first?
I have a specific person that it happens
like you're almost ready to have your lawyer send an apology and send money when it's like, wait, I actually wrote that first, not them. Did they plagiarize me?
No, times 1,000.
as if, but
yeah, no.
You know, I was reading Hala Aliyan's book, The 29th Year, which is just an incredible poetry collection. And she has this poem where she's like, I stole your boyfriend. I didn't steal your boyfriend. And it kind of does this thing where it's like, I lit myself on fire. I didn't light myself on fire. But I like how she does it better. And it's just this amazing poem that plays with truth. And the whole book is partly about dealing with like alcohol addiction and sobriety. And so it's kind of like, oh, she's talking about lying to yourself, lying to others. This idea of what we can believe and not believe. And so that's something that I've found so much inspiration for now, where it's kind of doing some stuff that I was doing in my first book, but I want to circle it even more.
Yes.
You know, and kind of answer the question a different way.
No, and I love that we keep on coming back to the phrase circling, because I do feel like that's your aesthetic, this circling it. I know you've used the simile like vultures over prey, and it seems like, especially if we're going to talk about you writing from the wound, writing from the scar, that your work circles those scars. That's just such a pretty image. So thinking about that, what's next for Ruth? What you scribbling now? What are you doing? What are you thinking next when it comes to poetry? Talk to me.
Yeah, well, so I guess the thing that's been kind of holding most of my attention recently is my first novel is coming out next year. So I've been doing a lot of prose lately. Yeah, just kind of approaching very similar questions, but from this other lens of, you know, long form narrative storytelling. So I have a novel called All Night Pharmacy coming out with Catapult in July of 2023. So that's been very different than writing a book of poems. But I think that when you write long form prose as a poet, I still have that same impulse to polish every single sentence.
Yes.
And like now, my final draft is due to my editor next week, and I'm just lying awake at night thinking of sentences like, "She smiled at me," because like you would never put that in a poem. Like that's so boring. It's so dead. It's doing nothing. But but you can't. But it would be so exhausting to read a book where every sentence was poetic. So that's kind of the thing I'm fighting right now, is trying to keep that poetry, keeping this, you know, prose that people know is written by a poet without just kind of like punching them in the face, so, which has been interesting to take a little bit of time away from poetry. And I've been very afraid, like, what if I can't poem anymore? What if I don't know how? But I've kind of realized that every time I write a poem, I feel like I'm relearning how to write a poem. Do you feel that way?
Oh,
where it's
times
like
1,000.
every time you sit down, you're like, oh, I forgot. I'm just never going to write a poem again.
No, I'm happy
and
that
then
they
it
ever
teaches you
come
how to
back.
do it. Yeah. So that's kind of where I've been at, is I've been writing a few new poems. I do have a new second manuscript that is basically done. Haven't started sending it out yet because I want to have some distance between when the novel comes out and poetry comes out, because partly just because you don't want to beg your loved ones, you know, like in such a short span to please buy your book, please support it. I feel like it's a little bit like we need to spread out the favor economy.
No, I can dig it. Well, do you have anything from that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I would love to. But yeah, so I do have a complete second poetry collection that hopefully will come out in the next few years. That is kind of, I heard this quote by Foucault the other day that I really liked, that I'm going to butcher, but it was something about how he likes when his new book answers a question that his last book raised.
Ooh, no, that's really smart. Yeah.
So I feel like this book sort of, you know, raised some questions about kind of rape culture and also privilege and whiteness and things that were not addressed directly but were sort of in the ether, and now the new book is sort of circling them more directly. So that feels like kind of the connective tissue between them.
I love that you're circling again. Always circling
Always
back.
circling, but hopefully trying to either get a little closer to the body or
almost
you know,
this
doing something a little
changing
different.
same but getting better each time.
That's the hope. So this new poem is called Wormhole, and it was published in American Poetry Review a few years ago. Watch the squirrel clean its face until its hands are your hands, until the chemical energy of sunlight is gentle as a kiss on your cheek. Don't stop until the senators inside you go home to their creamed corn and televisions, their partners and dogs, until the two-way mirrors and oyster knives you hang from your optic nerves like laundry are taken by the wind. Let it uncurl your eyelashes. Let it carry you in its pocket like a mint. It's all true. The weird sex thing, the yellow pills, how I climbed myself like a tree. Basically anything can hold itself hostage. The question isn't why, but so? Still, there are ways of touching without bulldozing, ways of washing a body without making the person inside it feel like a plate. You don't have to sympathize with the teeth of chainsaws if you don't want to. Where you go when you enter a wormhole is not important.
Goodness. That it's not about the why, but so. And from somebody who's speaking from the wound, from the scar, and to say that within a poem, you teach me. You teach me every time. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doug. This was so fun.